Hello and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. The Easter Sunday terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka have outraged and horrified people around the globe. The death toll currently stands at over 350, with an additional 500 injured. Today we're discussing how the social and political situation in Sri Lanka contributed to this atrocity taking place, and what Marxists say is the way out of desperate situations such as this. We recommend that you listen to this podcast in conjunction with episode 26 on terrorism. Now, over to Sarah Rack.
Okay, I'm here today with Isai Priya. Isai is a member of the Socialist Party and also a leading activist in the Tamil Solidarity campaign. Hi, Isai.
Thank you. Hi, Sarah.
And today we're going to be discussing, in light of the horrific attacks that took place in Sri Lanka over Easter weekend. So to start with, Isai, do you maybe just want to explain what it is that happened in Sri Lanka on Sunday?
So we woke up on Easter Sunday and the whole world attention was on Sri Lanka following 8 blasts that took place. And I think it's right to begin that our first and foremost thoughts are with all the victims and all those affected by the blast. I mean, it's like you said, it's atrocious. It's an absolute shockwave that's sent through. And I think so far, the last time I checked, it was 359 lives have been lost and more than 500 have been injured. And it is like, it was a well-coordinated attack, so the timing was quite simultaneously almost. And just to kind of say in a bit more detail, it was in like 8 places and it was like in 3 famous churches where masses are held in the 3 languages, English, Tamil and Singalam. And there's also targeted tourist locations such as hotels and restaurants.
And what's kind of been the initial response of people to this terrible event?
I think it was an attack on all communities. I mean, the victims were from Sri Lanka's main ethnic and religious groups. And, you know, the victims that spoke Tamil and Sinhala languages. But I think the initial response had been one of shock, and not just in Sri Lanka, but across the world. And I think it was more of a shock when you see a sudden rise in the death toll as well. It was like, you know, it started off with 50 and now it's like over 350. And I think such a mass killing has never actually taken place in the history of Sri Lanka in this level. But again, Sri Lanka violence and killings are not new in Sri Lanka. I mean, this year has marked the 10-year anniversary of the genocide that took place in 2009, where the Sri Lankan government was responsible for killing over 140,000 people, it was estimated. And I think the events on Sunday has opened up the wounds of that memory as well. Like, people see these images on TV and then the flashback of what happened in 2009, the loss there. And also it's more of a loss because people haven't really recovered from it. There hasn't been any kind of information on the disappeared of people that are still missing from 10 years ago. And so the Sunday event was really like a reminder of that. But what was really, what you could really see was a huge human solidarity that actually took place immediately after the attack. And I think in the short period of time it was released that there was a blood shortage for those injured and victims. And so there was a huge human solidarity where people were queuing up in hospitals to donate blood. And this was like in hospitals in predominantly in like Muslim populated areas, in Tamil populated areas, as well as Sinhala populated area. The whole 3 communities came together to show solidarity, to give what they could, and it was a real sense of we're all together in this, and this is an attack on all of us.
Yeah, that's something that is quite common in following these kind of disasters and attacks, isn't it? And that is often missed out, that, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on people attacking other people, but that's actually a tiny minority. And from the majority, we always see an outpouring of human solidarity, don't we?
You're right. I mean, I think a lot of people look at Facebook or their own medium and then see like a few comments which dominate and they think that is it. But actually, if you look broader than that, people are actually coming together in a very more solid way than before.
Yeah, but then that is kind of ordinary people's response.
You're right.
But then what's been the response of the government in Sri Lanka, for example?
Well, they kind of issued a national emergency and a curfew was implemented. But they also deployed more armies on the street. And this kind of fueled, like, it made people more uncomfortable because of the history of Sri Lanka, where the army is not seen as someone that protects them, but more as someone that actually stirs up division amongst the communities. And it actually increased in some ways the tension that exists. So they tried to do that. But I think what was shocking was that on Monday, on the press conference, like the health minister revealed that they actually knew that warnings were given prior to this attack, and that foreign intelligence agency were saying that churches might be targeted, foreigners might be targeted, and stuff like that. So this was shown, but they did no action on that, and it was just kept on a lower authority level. So it didn't even go to the Prime Minister or the President. And what was shocking was that Ranil was the Prime Minister. He said that if that had reached them, then they could have actually prevented a vast majority of the loss that had taken place. And it wasn't done because there was a breach in communication, which is not really a good enough excuse, really. And at the moment, the Defence Secretary and the Chief Police are under huge pressure to resign following their misconduct of the method, and the loss obviously is not them but ordinary people who are suffering still. I think the final proceedings have taken place in Sri Lanka, and the loved ones are saying in a very tragic way bye to their lost ones. But it's still, it's not something that's going to go away lightly just by the government issuing an apology for a misconduct of what should be a normal process.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's worth explaining to people who don't know much about the situation in Sri Lanka a bit about the general political situation. Who are the government? What, and how is this maybe played into the tensions that exist in society there?
Yeah, like I said, there's three main communities in Sri Lanka. So there's a singular majority communities, the Tamil community, Tamil-speaking communities, and the Muslim community as well. And in a way, since the end of the war in May 2009, there has been a continuous whipping up of tension between these communities, consciously done by the government. And at the end of the war, all communities were promised peace, that it would finally be over and that they can go back to their normal life, the democratic rights, and, have a standard of living. But none of that has actually materialized. In fact, no concrete measures have taken to improve the conditions for the tens of thousands of war victims, as well as ordinary people. And like I said, people are still held in political prisoners, for example, and there is still a big gap on the missing people information. And so the continuous denial of democratic rights and attack on minorities has kept that tension bubbling underneath the surface. But also I think it's worth mentioning that some Buddhist extremist groups were consciously promoted by the Sri Lankan politicians, and particularly by the former president Mahinda Rajapaksa and his family. And in effect, there is like a election pending coming on in Sri Lanka, a presidential and a parliamentary election. And the former defence minister, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is planning to stand. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's using this to whip up again anti-Muslim propaganda. But also it's worth mentioning there that this particular Defence Minister, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was actually involved in establishing an openly racist Buddhist monk organisation called Podu Balasena, BBS. And these are like, again, this particular group went around and attacking Muslim communities and also stirring up this anti-Muslim rhetorics, especially on the east side of Sri Lanka, where the vast majority of the Muslim community live. So it's like a purpose attack on the Muslim communities. And we see historically, like, Sri Lanka is not the only country, but, these divide and rule techniques are used to split through the communities and really keep themselves in power, and not, it's easier for them, for the right wing and the ruling class, to say that there is a lack of services because of this particular community, rather than to say it's because of capitalism in general. And the government is doing that more as well, because in Sri Lanka there has been a change of government in 2015 where the Rajapaksa regime was defeated, and this new so-called democratic, in quotation mark, came to power, and they promised, they came to power under this program called 100-Day Program, where they said they would implement all these policies, which were really progressive policies for everyone. Like, they was some kind of an advantage, like some kind of good thing for like farmers, for students. It was like trying to, it was a really good progressive program, and they got elected on that basis. But really, that program hasn't materialized in any way whatsoever. And they are in a bit of a situation because there is a financial crisis in Sri Lanka, and the IMF is kind of dictating the neoliberal fence. So the government is forced to, and to be reluctantly, they're not really fighting back, but they're carrying through this neoliberal fence of privatization and cuts in funding. And we can see that the IMF has like put forward conditions on their budget, for example, where they reduced the amount for education and healthcare, but increased the defense budget. So it's kind of like, where the incentive really is. But it's also important to point out that there has been a numerous protests against these politics in Sri Lanka. And historically, free education and free healthcare is like one of the proudest achievements of the working class in Sri Lanka, where they fought to get it. And still, up to today, free education and free healthcare is maintained in Sri Lanka. And it's a constant battle and struggle to maintain that. But what was interesting was that last year, we talk a lot about the political situation in Britain, where we see the parliament like really in crisis. And the similar situation happened in Sri Lanka in October, where there was a parliamentary and a constitutional crisis, where the current president has sacked the prime minister undemocratically and appointed the war criminal Rajapaksa as the new prime minister. And it was an unprecedented crisis, and it led to a standoff really, where there was a bit of a fight going on. And in the parliament, if you looked at some of the video, there was like throwing chairs at each other, throwing chili powders at each other. It was a really bizarre scenario to see. But that was an expression of the crisis that exists. And so, like to say, there's like two main parties in Sri Lanka, but the government is more of a coalition. And there is that constant battle between them two. And because of the election coming up, they will try again to use this to try and bring themselves either to stay in power or to change the government. But yeah, so that would be a kind of a mini outline of the situation in terms of the parliamentary situation in Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So you mentioned the kind of reactionary Buddhist groups that have been trying to abuse the situation, but there are actually all kinds of right-wing reactionary forces, aren't there, who are trying to capitalise in the aftermath of the attacks already, just in the first few days.
Yeah, as an activist in Socialist Party and Tamil Solidarity, but I think as a normal person, you would get really annoyed when you see people like Donald Trump or Theresa May suddenly coming out, seemingly like they care about the victims. And on the surface, they say that they want all community to stand together and they preach about unity. But that's not what they do in their policies. And for example, like Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, for example, is trying to use this opportunity to blame it on the Pakistan nationalists and try and again whip up this Hindu nationalist chauvinist thing that he does to try and blame it on the Muslim communities rather than a few, because this is not carried out by the Muslim community, and we must absolutely be clear of that. This wasn't carried out by any community, it was carried out by a few individuals, although we don't know who has officially, there's under investigation and there's been some claims, but we're still not sure who has done it. But what our starting point is that this is an outrageous attack, and this is like something we absolutely condemn, and this is nothing to do with the communities and nothing to do with the ordinary people. And so we must be quite clear of that. But I also think Donald Trump, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if he uses this to try again to stir up. He's already doing it like in a way like this anti-Muslim sentiment, and try and wouldn't even put it past him to say that we should go further into wars and bombs and stuff like that. And I think we should just be cautious that they will try and capitulate on this, and that their immediate thought is not about victims or people of ordinary people and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And of course, we've seen just in the recent period that these kind of terrorist attacks can be carried out by people of all faiths against people of all faiths. You know,
Exactly,
that's not the decisive thing in the situation.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is our alternative to this, I suppose? We're talking about how badly it's being handled by the Sri Lankan government, how it's trying to, different right-wing politicians and so on are trying to use it. But what do you think needs to happen in the wake of the attacks?
I think first and foremost we need to be quite clear that we oppose all scapegoating and divisive, hatey propaganda, like no blaming any particular communities. But I also think we need to be quite clear that we defend all democratic rights, including the right to religion, the right to faith to practice it, but we also defend the freedom of speech and assembly and the right to strike and protest, because all of these democratic rights will be under attack by the Sri Lankan government. They will use this as an opportunity to cramp down on any kind of struggle emerging against their right-wing policies, against their neoliberal attack. And I think we must be first and foremost quite clear that we defend the right to people to protest and the right for them to practice and for their faith, the right to religion. Because it's like, what's the background of this, isn't it? That's the question we need to ask. What led to this attack? And we, like, our starting point is to say, what can we do in the near future, or in what kind of policies we can implement to kind of stop the very conditions that's providing this, again, I'm not defending the people that carried through the attack, but what is letting the groundwork for these kind of extremist view to take place, really, to what's the ground they're taking. And I think we need to kind of fight for the rights of all minorities in Sri Lanka. We defend the rights of the Tamil-speaking people, for example, for their right to self-determination. But we also defend the Muslim communities. We want all stops, either verbal or whatever, on the Muslim community to be stopped immediately. Because, like I said, it is the working class and the poor that pay the prices for these attacks. And the other thing I think we need to do and kind of expose is the hypocrisy of the Sri Lankan government as well, to say that it is their policies that is actually leading to this situation, and we need to, there's an election coming up, and the primary task will be for us to kind of build a working class mass party that can actually put forward concrete demands similar to the 100-day program, but actually implement it in the interest of Sinhala Tamil Muslim communities. And I think we call upon all the progressive working class organisation to come together to discuss what kind of platform we can do that in, and actually put forward a real alternative, because that is the only way we can actually fight, first of all, the conditions that are breeding this, but also to actually defend communities as well. I also think we should think about communities organising themselves to for lookouts, or to try and come together and defend themselves as well, in a way like that they organize some kind of gathering or public meeting to try and talk about how they feel and stuff like that, because there is an urgent need, I think, in the straight aftermath, that we should put more money into health care, in the sense that you're discussion with them to deal with their post-trauma stress disorder, to kind of really talk about what they're going through and help them through that process of the recovery process, but also talk to them about what is actually, make sure that they don't blame any particular communities, and try and through that build that confidence in them to actually fight against the right wing of the Sri Lankan government. Because Sri Lanka has a very strong history of united struggle, and like I said, it is through the struggle of the various communities coming together that we actually won some of the free healthcare, free education that exists, and we need to reteach that history, because that is being rewritten by the Sri Lankan government, and we need to say what is the history of struggle in Sri Lanka, and who are our natural allies, who do we align ourselves with. And I think through that, but also through a common program of concrete demands such as healthcare, education and homes for everyone, for a decent living standard, that we can actually unite these different communities on a class basis and actually fight against the real root cause of all of these atrocities and all this, the ground that's breeding these situations.
And that's kind of the work that Tamil Solidarity is all about, really, isn't it? And, you know, you're very involved in the Tamil Solidarity campaign, which is kind of led by young Tamil activists in particular, many who come from Sri Lanka originally themselves. Do you maybe want to tell people a bit about what is Tamil Solidarity about and how people can get involved and what it tries to do in these types of circumstances?
Sure. Like, Tamil Solidarity was set up in 2009, and it was actually set up before the end of the war in May. And it was set up to say that there's a war coming and we need to stop it. But in the aftermath of the massacre that took place, of the genocide, where, you know, like I say, 140,000 people died, we were the only organisation within the Tamil diaspora to put forward the clear demand that the struggle must continue. Because you can imagine there's a sense of demoralisation that takes place immediately after. Like, you see all these people being killed, and it has a personal effect. But we said that the struggle must go on, but on what basis the struggle goes on? Because at that point, a lot of organisations turned to the United Nations, thinking that they would be able to win the rights for the Tamil people, but also the justice for victims through UN. And one of our campaign has been to expose that and say that what is a UN? UN is not something in the interest of ordinary working class people. It's something there to kind of make things, saying that they're doing things for people, but in effect all their policies are against them. And also, just to give you an example, in Kashmir, for example, they passed on 94 or 174 resolution, I can't remember how much, but a ridiculously large amount of resolution, but nothing has materialized. And that's because it's not in their interest to do that. They don't really care, in a way, as well. Like, the UN has known that the genocide was taking place in Sri Lanka, but they did no action whatsoever to stop it. So, you know, one of our tasks has been to expose that. And one thing that we concretely put forward within the Tamil community is the fact that how do we win the rights for Tamil-speaking people? So it's both in Sri Lanka and here as well. So in Sri Lanka, we defend the right to the self-determination of Tamil people, including separation. We put forward a common policy to unite, like I said previously, the various communities and actually fight for the rights of everyone. But here in Britain, Tamil Solidarity is trying to organise the Tamil communities here to take part in the struggle in Britain as well, because most of the Tamil speaking people, if you look at it, they're either in like low paid or public sector jobs, and they're like, you know, disproportionately affected because of the blacker nation on the austerity measures. So we try and get them involved in struggles, get them involved in, if they're workers, we have this campaign called Join a Union campaign, where we try and encourage them to join trade unions, to take part in their struggle, but also to link up with what we call our natural allies, who are like the working class people, the other oppressed communities, to fight against the right-wing government and to really fight for the rights of ordinary working class people, which is something that we're the only campaign that's actually doing within the Tamil communities. So we work heavily with the trade unionists as well. We got Unison, which is nationally affiliated to us. We also got NIPSTA, which is a public sector union in Northern Ireland, which is also nationally affiliated to us. But we also last year had PCH, which is a civil service union, who affiliated to the Tamil Solidarity. And this is quite important because there are home office workers in the PCS, and, you know, the question of who controls borders and stuff like that has been raised. So all of this we do to bring together to the working class, so we can actually put forward a real alternative. But so in the sense that how you can help, if you are a trade unionist, for example, contact us to so that we can speak at your branches, to affiliate to us. But also you can donate us money. But most importantly, if there's a struggle locally in your area where you know where there might be some kind of Tamil speaking person, contact us. We will try and talk to them and link that up as well. So these are some of the things that you can do. We got a website as well which you can check out, which is like tamilsolidarity.org, which again goes through more of an update on the political situation as well as the struggles taking place in Sri Lanka, which is something that is not reported as well. We supported Sri Tunga Jayasuriya, who was a USP, United Socialist Party member in Sri Lanka, again, a sister organisation of the Socialist Party that fights against the Sri Lankan government and for the liberation of the working class, really. we make sure that our struggle is linked up with all these other forces, so we can actually be stronger, united together on a common program.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Isai.
Thank you.
Don't forget to check out episode 26 of the podcast on terrorism. You can find a link to that and several things to read on Sri Lanka by going to the episode notes at socialistparty.org.uk/podcast. Please leave us a review, subscribe and share the podcast to help us get more listeners. And if you like what you're hearing and want to get involved with the Socialist Party, we want you to join us. Leave your details at socialistparty.org.uk/join.